When you think of the book of Revelation, your mind probably jumps to beasts and plagues and these really complex prophecies about the end of the world. It's got a reputation for being one of the most confusing books ever written. But what if there's a key to understanding it that we've been overlooking for centuries? Let's dive in.
And that question right there is what this is all about. What if the book isn't primarily about predicting some distant future, but it's actually about something that has already happened? Now, I know that sounds like a radical idea, but it's one that completely reframes everything we thought we knew.
For almost 2,000 years, scholars have been trying to crack the code of Revelation, mostly by looking ahead to the future. But as our source material points out, that whole approach has pretty much been a blind alley. The book is still a huge mystery for most people, which kind of tells you something, right? Maybe it's time for a fresh perspective.
So where do we find this new perspective? Well, the whole argument really hinges on a single, powerful phrase that's tucked away right in the book itself. And this little phrase could be the very key that unlocks the entire puzzle.
Here it is, Revelation 19, verse 10. Now, at first glance, it seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But how you interpret this one little line, it changes absolutely everything about how you read the rest of the book.
See, this phrase can be understood in two totally different ways. The common view, the one we're used to, sees it as a prophetic message about Jesus and what's going to happen in the future. But the proposed view reads it as the eyewitness testimony of Jesus, like a historical record of his actual physical life, his death, and his resurrection. And with that one tiny shift in grammar, the whole focus of the book pivots from the future to the past.
Okay, but why? Why would the author, John, write this incredibly complex, symbolic book just to talk about stuff that already happened? Well, to get the motive, we have to travel back in time and look at a huge crisis the early church was facing right when he was writing.
And here it is. The big threat was a heresy called docetism. Basically, it was the idea that Jesus was a ghost, a spirit who never had a real physical body. He only seemed human. Now, for John, who was one of the last living people to have actually known Jesus, this was a direct assault on the very heart of his faith. This gives him a huge motive to write something that essentially screams from the rooftops, "No, Jesus was real."
And John's response to this is just brilliant. In his first letter, he's not being poetic here. He's being almost legalistic. He's giving an eyewitness testimony. He's saying, we heard him with our own ears, we saw him with our own eyes, we touched him with our hands. He was physically here.
And it doesn't stop there. John's other writings are just packed with these gritty, flesh and blood details. He makes a point of mentioning Jesus spitting on the ground, washing feet, being physically wounded. Every single one of these details is a direct counterattack to that docetic idea that Jesus wasn't a real person. And this consistent theme, well, it builds the foundation for our next point.
Okay, so let's recap. We have our clue, that reinterpreted phrase, and we have a powerful motive, the fight against docetism. Now let's put it all together and get to the solution, which is this really radical new theory about what the book of Revelation actually is.
So here's the big reveal. What if Revelation isn't a blueprint for the future at all? What if it's a massive, symbolic, spiritual retelling of the single most important event in Christian history, the Easter story? The whole book, one grand allegory.
An allegory, it has two layers. The surface layer of Revelation is what we all know. It's full of strange visions, dragons, beasts, angels, the whole shebang. But according to this theory, the hidden meaning, the deeper reality the book is pointing to, is the physical, historical story of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. It's his way of shouting, he was real, in the most epic, unforgettable way possible.
Now, that is a huge claim, I know, but the source material lays out some really compelling evidence to connect the dots between the wild visions of Revelation and the actual events of the gospel. So let's look at the first major connection.
The very first verse of Revelation says it's meant to show things that must soon take place. Now, for 2,000 years, that's been a real head-scratcher. But what if soon actually meant, soon? Think about it. On the road to Jerusalem, Jesus tells his disciples exactly what will soon take place: his betrayal, death, and resurrection. The opening of Revelation perfectly mirrors the opening of the Easter story. It's right there.
And if you thought that was interesting, this next part is kind of the smoking gun. The source argues that key chapters in Revelation map directly onto the exact sequence of the Easter story. So chapter 16 is an allegory for Christ's passion. Chapter 17 is about his death. Chapter 18 represents his burial.
and chapter 20, his resurrection. Once you see that pattern, that clear sequence of death, burial, and resurrection, it becomes really hard to unsee it.
So let's just lay it all out on the table. A futurist says the prophecy is about the future. A historicist says it's about all of church history. But this Easter allegory idea, it's the only one where the testimony of Jesus means exactly what it says. The eyewitness testimony of the gospel passed. It aligns perfectly with that key phrase back in Revelation 19:10.
So what does this all mean for us? If this interpretation holds water, it forces a complete and honestly radical reframing of how we approach one of the most famous and misunderstood books ever written.
Here's the key takeaway. The whole focus just flips. It stops being about decoding future timelines and trying to predict newspaper headlines. Instead, it becomes about understanding that the ultimate, world-changing end-time events were the passion and resurrection of Jesus. They've already happened. And this brings us to the final, really powerful conclusion from the source. It calls for us to, and I'm quoting here, completely abandon our obsession with the future and focus instead upon past gospel flesh and blood happenings. The real message, it argues, is to look back, to focus on the historical, physical, flesh and blood reality of the Easter story. And that leaves us with one last, pretty fascinating question to think about. If Revelation isn't a roadmap to the future, but instead it's this profound, symbolic defense of an event in the past, then what does it truly reveal to us, right now? What message does this ancient epic allegory actually hold for us today?